Could you first just start off by introducing yourself?
My name's Brenda Wewell. I work as the director of the USC initiative to eliminate homelessness.
So, the first question, substantive question, is what is the impact of experiencing homelessness on an individual's sort of physical and mental health? Does it trigger what's sort of the trauma response, and could it be called a sort of a traumatic situation?
I would definitely call it traumatic. I don't think I've ever talked to anyone who wouldn't describe their experience of losing housing, ending up on the street, having to learn how to adjust and survive on the street in various kinds of situations that are very unprotected. With that, they didn't actually call it traumatic. It's a very personal, oftentimes part of the trauma really has to do with feeling like a sense of total inadequacy, that they were unable, or powerlessness, that they were unable to take care of themselves and ended up in that situation. So there's that hit on the self-esteem, the trauma related to that, as well as the assault on the senses of being in a situation where it, at least initially, it's unfamiliar. You have to figure out what to do each day to survive. There's a lot of different dangers in your environment than when you were in a housed situation. There's the potential for violence on your person. There's the lack of shelter and the environmental elements, whether it's really hot or it's raining. How do you protect yourself? How do you get sufficient food and water? How about bathroom facilities and cleaning type facilities? How about just the basics of life? If you have, say you have a medical condition and the doctor gave you some meds, how do you protect that and maintain a regular daily schedule with that? So it's just so traumatic to the human system to deal with all of those things that it puts people into an immediacy of threat and danger and fear that is kind of the definition of what trauma is. When you don't feel safe and you don't necessarily trust the environment to meet your needs or to be consistent or regulated, and how that affects your nervous system to protect yourself and be on alert for any dangers that might appear, and then how to deal with the different dangers that you do encounter.
Could you talk a little bit about sort of you mentioned that there's this effect on your nervous system of experiencing that trauma, or the effect on your nervous system of sort of not having access to the things that you sort of need to survive, maybe some kind of a survival. um, uh, I guess I would call it kind of colloquially being in survival mode. um,
Mhm.
what what effect does that have on one's nervous system and maybe potentially on their mental health?
So, first of all, it is more likely that people who end up homeless may have had some other kinds of violence or trauma kinds of related situations in their lives. So, they may be more likely to have their nervous system reactivated or activated at a very high level, which means then that their hormones are flowing, they're prepared for danger and either to fight, flight, or freeze. And when that goes on for a long time, it creates mental health kinds of conditions because the anxiety can become really pervasive, and the sense of danger that goes along with that, the sense of isolation and depression. How did I end up here? There's nobody safe, nobody I can trust. People come and they leave, and I don't have any consistent way of getting my needs met within the environment. So it truly does affect the nervous system. Often, what will happen is there has been some history of that. Now you're getting reactivated with it. And for most people, high levels of trauma have been associated with long-term, both mental health conditions and substance use. It's sort of like the human body can only take so much and the nervous system can only get activated so much before it starts to break down a little bit. And one of the ways that human beings often will respond to that is either by kind of going into a more fantasy related world that's not as tuned into the real world, or to use drugs or alcohol to kind of protect themselves from having to be right in, face the difficulties that they're experiencing to kind of give them some protection from it.
You mentioned just at the beginning that one of the things that is traumatic is weathering the elements associated with being unhoused. Um, with climate change, when we expect to see these increases in extreme heat days, or can those maybe like extended extreme heat days associated with dehydration, et cetera, can those exacerbate the same effects on mental health or the effects on the
Oh,
body in that way?
yeah, I actually really worry about that because um, it's so, we take it for granted that when it gets really hot, we can go inside. We get into a place that's protected and we have the air conditioning and we just sort of take that for granted. But somebody who's unhoused doesn't really have the same options and may not have the capability to even get someplace, or they may not be wanted in some of those places. Like, sometimes people will try to go into stores, etc., and be asked to leave because they don't appear put together well. So, but what you get is that extended sense of powerlessness because the element is so intense and so unpleasant. And I really worry about people too with the dehydration, because when you're homeless, you don't really have access to regular hydration. That's one of the more difficult things to have. And you may not want to be hydrated as much because you don't have easy access to a bathroom. So if you've ever been in a situation, even camping, and you thought, well, I'm not going to drink so much tonight because I don't want to have to get up in the middle of the night and go out and have to find the bathroom in the middle of the night. It's sort of that thing. So people will often limit their intake of liquid. And the impact of that dehydration on your system and on your body, and how that affects the electrolytes, how it affects the chemicals in the brain, the hormones. I just really worry it detracts from health in many ways as well as mental health. Um, I heard somebody talking, they were giving a tour and they mentioned something about on Skid Row. A lot of times when people are living on the streets, there's not a lot of shade. It's not easy necessarily to get shade. So a tent may, but oftentimes it soaks up the heat as well. So somebody talked about how hard it is to just sit outside day after day, or even in your tent with that heat unrelenting, and it saps your energy, and it also starts to create a sense of hopelessness, and it makes it actually harder to energize and to want to go out to get food, it's sort of like I'm just exhausted. And that dehydration can increase that sense of physical exhaustion. So I always really worry about people under those circumstances.
Sort of in that same vein, when you're exhausted due to facing the elements, as well as what you talked about, just the general trauma of being on the street and how that causes heightened states of alert and fatigue and all sorts of other reactions. Could that also impact one's ability to get housing and exit homelessness?
I believe it does, because what happens is the physical and mental capacity, the functioning, the ability to problem solve, to think about the future, set a goal, and take the actions toward it all of your energy is focused on where am I going to have a bathroom to go to? Where am I going to find something to eat or drink because I'm hungry or thirsty? So you're really focused there. Or how am I going to make sure that I'm not attacked because it's getting dark and I don't feel safe around here? And I've heard that, I heard somebody else talking about that they were beaten up, or as a woman was they were raped. So if that's where all of your energy is focused on, it makes it extremely difficult. You don't have the same energy. There's depression, there's anxiety that saps it, as well as the physical exhaustion that goes with it. It makes it really hard because, number one, the sense that it's possible to see anything else, the sense that there's a loss of hope. It's sort of hard to even imagine all of the barriers or the things you would have to overcome to get from where you are right now to a housed state. And for a lot of people, it just looks impossible. And they will justify that too, because they'll say, well, people came around and they said they could help me get housing. And I said, okay, I want it. And then they never came back. And I've had that happen numerous times. Or they said I could go into a shelter and I went into the shelter and it was dirty there and I didn't feel safe and some of my stuff got stolen. So I'm never going back there. So it really does limit the possibilities for people often. And the initial level of internal agency or motivation that would be often necessary for people to really pull themselves together enough to be able to and our systems are horrible. They have so many barriers and obstacles in it. There's so much time it takes to get from one thing to another. It's not user friendly. If you were homeless on the streets and you were going to try to get through all of those obstacles to get the funding you needed, to get all the paperwork you needed, to find a place, to get over to look at it, to get all of the different pieces that are involved with that, it's not a user-friendly process. And it's a very time-consuming process. And oftentimes for people, it just looks so overwhelming that it's hard for them to um, have the energy or the motivation to try to do it.
One of the things that you're discussing is sort of this the fact that services are inaccessible in a lot of ways. Um, and you, given that the experience of homelessness can be really, really traumatizing, I've heard the term trauma informed care or trauma informed service delivery. And I was wondering if you could touch on that. Just what does that mean and what might that look like for those who are experiencing homelessness?
Okay. So I think the first piece is that if I'm a service provider and you're somebody who's homeless, the first thing I'm going to do is want to understand what's happened in your life that got you to where you are. And typically in the past, the paradigm we looked at is like, well, what did you do wrong? Like, were you a drug user? Did you not take your medication? Did you have trouble on your job and get into a fight and sort of like what was wrong with you that led you to this place? And trauma informed care totally does away with it. It understands that we can we can understand a person based on understanding the kinds of things they've experienced and the way those experiences were traumatic for them and how they then adapted or responded to those, so that you come from a place of understanding where the person is at. And then I'm a good social worker, so I always focus on starting where the client is at. So what that means is I'm not going to come up with a menu of things and I'm not going to say, okay, well, you should get shelter and then that'll get you housing. I'm going to say, what's important to you? What are your priorities? Where do you want to see yourself? What's happened before that didn't work for you? And what would you really like to have right now? What type of help would feel best or be most useful to you from your perspective? So I'm really tuning in. The client is a partner, and we're working as a team. So it's not like I'm the expert and I know what's wrong with you and I'm going to diagnose you and then I'm going to treat you. It's more like we're going to work together, and it's really more like I'm going to try to understand where you're struggling and how can I provide support for that. So that's one piece of it. And that has to do also with a lot of client choice and client voice. We want to uplift the client. We want to take the client seriously. If they say, this doesn't work for me, I don't want to go to that environment, or I don't want to be in that community. Okay, that's really important to take into account. You have some good reasons for that. And I'm not going to just look at it like you're being resistant and you don't want to get housed. I'm going to take you seriously for that. So that's kind of another piece of it. And then I think the third piece really has to do with culture and understanding the kind of background and how that is perceived, and how the situation of homelessness that you're experiencing may have come out of your cultural background. Maybe you're Latinx and you had family members who immigrated and had difficulty entering the country. And how did that affect your path that led you to where you are? Or maybe you're Black and you came from a community that was chronically poor, underinvested, under-resourced, and where systemic racism was the name of the day. And how did that affect the choices and the ways that you had to be able to respond and shut off some of the options that might have been available if you were from a different cultural background. So really fully understanding and giving voice to that is another part of it. If people really feel like you are supporting them, you're understanding where they're coming from, what are the struggles that they've had that they didn't know how to deal with, and that you're offering some tools to help them. One of the things that a lot of programs are doing now is they're trying to help people have some basic ways to manage their own nervous system so they can start feeling more in control of their body. Because when you're highly traumatized and your nervous system is dysregulated, it's going up and down and you're feeling all these hormones going through. And one minute you're really irritated and the next minute you're really depressed. So there are some techniques that can be taught that are basic techniques for people to help them ground, calm their nervous system, and start to feel a little bit more regulated in terms of their just ability to see what's going on and not be so emotional, and then to be able to kind of build a relationship and build trust. That's the other piece of it, is when people have had a lot of trauma, they've really degraded their capacity to trust other people and relationships. And so that has to be slowly and carefully rebuilt through very consistent, authentic, sincere, responsible relationships with good communication.
Before I move to the last question, yeah, a lot of what you said resonates with what one of the speak up advocates that I spoke with who has lived experience was saying that when she went to seek services, they didn't meet her where she was, that like, they were requiring things of her that she didn't feel comfortable doing or that she didn't think were important at the time when she was trying to meet other goals. And then also that she sort of a through line of the conversation with her was this idea of compassion. So it sounds to me like trauma informed care at a very basic level is having compassion for another person. Of course, it involves elevating their desires, etc., and centering them in the solution and understanding their history and their unique circumstances. But it also seems like it's just sort of basically what would it mean to treat somebody else with some kind of dignity and compassion, and then moving from there.
I appreciate you brought that up, because I think that the shame element, the guilt and shame is so overpowering for people when they become homeless, because they feel that they're treated and perceived in a very stigmatized way by the general population, and they are often so aware of how difficult things were for them and where they maybe didn't do what they should have done in certain places, like we all do sometimes. But the level of shame when you're not able, you're really so powerless and destitute that you don't have any other choice but to live on the street, and you have nothing and you don't know where you're going to get it. The level of shame that goes with that is really high, and it takes a lot of kindness and compassion and support to help people to be able to move past that. That's an important part of like the healing, in order to be able to feel like you're worth having something more, and you're worth having a good place to live, a decent place to live, and a decent set of things in your life. I wanted to get into one other element related to the environment that we didn't quite get into, and that's that um, people are often living like underneath freeway overpasses and in industrial areas where there's not a lot of housing, because that those are safer or they get less hassle. And unfortunately, those are environments where they're very unsafe. The Judge Carter made a big point of recognizing the research that's been done about the exposure to carcinogens when you're by a freeway and all the cars are going by all the time. And then also in some of these industrial areas where there's chemical plants and there's corrosive rust, there's different kinds of waste products and stuff. So people are often in environments when they're not housed. When you're housed, there's like, well, you can't live in this area, they don't approve it. So you end up being in environments that are a lot safer. And but then when you're out, in the elements, and the only place you can find, oftentimes you're then exposed to a lot of very unhealthy kinds of pollutants of different types that are actually very harmful and disruptive to people's health. And what we see are people who are homeless. You see that they age about 20 years faster, that they pass away. Their fatality is about 20 years earlier on average. And part of that is the rough living often, but it's also the environment, the things like the dehydration, things like being exposed to really unhealthy environments that break down their bodies and make them much more likely to have very serious illnesses.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. Also, as far as like your mental health, there's various chemicals that you see in industrial settings. I mean, especially in like agricultural settings, that can cause that can cause you to get irritated more easily. That can cause you to get angry. That cause
Yeah, that's true. So that kind of exposure, which we sort of take for granted that we don't let people live in those environments, but when we allow people live on the streets, that kind of goes out the window.
Yeah, no, that's very true. What resources exist for people who are experiencing extreme heat?
I'm really not aware that there are any specific resources. I mean, I know that, for instance, our USC students that created the Water Drop Project, they cared about water and making sure, because it was a very hot summer last summer, that people had access to that. That's the only specific program. I know that a lot of the outreach programs do carry water and snacks with them, so that while they're encountering people on the streets to offer them services, they will offer them, some water as well as maybe some snacks. But in terms of dealing with extreme heat, I'm just not really aware of any very specific services, other than people who are really having a hard time with it will end up with medical symptoms and go to an emergency room. And it's cool in there. and they have to be evaluated and treated. And so that's one way that people will often find to survive that. And then other than that, it's a matter of, do you want to go into a shelter? Now, what they have developed is a process and a set of funding for what they call wet weather shelters. So they're like the winter shelter system. So when it gets really cold and it's really wet, and we don't want people to be out there in the rain, getting rained on, and how unhealthy that is. So they funded a series of shelters, and you can go to a certain place and there'll be a bus and it'll take you to the shelter. And they've expanded the number of wet weather shelters that are available in the city. I've not heard of any that were funded specifically around the heat. However, what I have heard is that there are times where the funding for the wet weather shelters has been expanded and extended through a much longer period of time, which often then does coincide with where a heat wave may occur. But it's not designed that way, because oftentimes here in Southern California, the highest times of year in terms of heat waves will be late August, September, maybe even through October. And usually that's the time that the wet weather shelters system is not operating. And then they start up again in like November, December, January, and then sometimes they'll last through March or maybe even April. So it's unfortunate. There really aren't. The only other options people have are to try to find somebody to work with to help them get some housing.
Yeah, as a short term solution, the main things that I've heard are people going into libraries or the mall or grocery stores or wherever that has.
I didn't think of that because of the pandemic.
Mm,
And over the pandemic, those were no longer available.
mhm.
So for during the last year, year and a half, those options were often not available. The libraries were closed, the malls were closed. So nice now, and then of course parks where they could maybe sit in the shade. Um, and that's why some people go into underpasses. Where can I get some shade is where people might go.
One of the things that I have heard people mention too is that when there is some sort of temporary, let's say the wet weather stations, you have to leave your things if you're
Right.
going to be going into one of these cooling stations. So if there's a sweep while you're there, you're going to lose your things. If somebody steals your things while you're there, you're going to lose your things, and that could set you so far back
Right.
on, or you just lose your necessities, you lose your essentials. Like you just get a 3 days. It's open between the 16th and the 19th, and then what?
Mhm. The biggest thing we need to do is build housing. We need to build affordable housing. Um, I believe it's still the case that there's at least 30,000 people on the coordinated entry system list that would be qualified to get housing and that are unhoused and that there's no place for. If you just think about it, back in 2020 in January, when they did the last homeless count, they identified in that one night 66,000 people. And there's basically 10,000 shelter beds.
You just need more affordable housing.
Mhm.